Thank you. Yes. So as Herrick very kindly said, I'm a ornithologist by trade. Even though this is, of course, the Lapworth Museum of Geology, I'm afraid there won't be that much of geology in this lecture, and for that I apologize in advance. And yes, my doctoral work, which was at that institution, focused on this little fellow, the Titicaca grebe. And even though there will be some very nice photos of Lake Titicaca, I'm afraid for today, this will be, because it's a lecture for the not just academics, but the popular audience as well, talking more broadly about why fieldwork matters and why, even in this age where we have ever more complicated mathematical models, where we have these big data sets, where we should still valorize fieldwork and we should still value field biology. But first, a bit of what is macroecology, what is macroevolution. It was only after I submitted the title of this presentation and I started actually to do the presentation that I realized that effectively I will be talking about macroecology rather than much macroevolution. A bit of macroevolution will come up, but it'll be mainly macroecology. And I do apologize if you are macroecologists and came purely for the macroevolution side of it. There's some debate as to how to formally define macroecology. If you've ever been to the British Ecological Society Macroecology Special Interest Group, which this is their logo, you will know that they have quite a hard and fast rule, but a fairly stringent one of don't try to define it too strictly and don't give a talk about how to define macroecology. In essence, it's trying to find broad-scale patterns in ecological and evolutionary phenomena. So it's at the intersection of biogeography, ecology, paleontology, macroevolution, and if you ever do come to a macroecology conference, you will see talks about all those subjects and none of the above. So it's a fairly broad field. But generally speaking, it's seen as somewhat distinct from fieldwork. Your average macroecological project will involve large data sets and a computer and some mathematical modeling and not necessarily the need to get your boots muddy. And because of that, if you talk to many macroecologists nowadays, a lot of them are very dear colleagues and I work with them and I do publish macroecology, and I'm, even though I'm an ornithologist by training, I'm nowadays essentially a macroecologist. Not necessarily will have the best field identification skills. Now, macroecology as a field is relatively young. The term was only coined in 1971, and it only really became popular after a very famous science paper in 1989, or at least very science amongst the type of people for whom science papers can become famous in their niche discipline. But a lot of the questions which macroecologist asks are actually a lot older. So if you go to read a macroecology journal, you'll see questions about Glauger's rule and Allen's rule and Bergman's rule. And these are these broad-scale patterns of how morphology changes in response to environment, in response to latitude or altitude and so on. And a lot of these are actually from the 19th or even the 18th century. So even though the discipline as a discipline in of itself that knows itself to exist is relatively new, the questions asked are much older. And actually, at its earliest foundation is sort of trying to understand the patterns of biodiversity, the patterns of morphology, a lot of those that laid the foundations for that were field biologists. And I just happen to quite like history of science, so I thought I'd put this very nice image of what I consider one of the first examples of sort of an attempt at a macroecological theory, which was by this chap here, Alexander von Humboldt, who some of you may have heard of. Hopefully, some of you will have heard of him, the 19th century German naturalist who published many things. He published a series of books called Cosmos, where he tried to have a complete compendium of the natural world. But his contribution to macroecology was this here, which he was essentially trying to explain why is it that you have more biodiversity or more species where there are mountains versus where there are not mountains. And that is still, if you know the Rabeck lab in Copenhagen, that he still publishes on trying to explain that to this day in macroecological terms. But Humboldt was inspired by his time in South America, in the Orinoco and the Amazon and the other parts of that fine continent. And therefore, so there is actually a fair bit of history when it comes to people asking macroecological questions that are inspired by their time in the field. The extinction of experience as a phenomenon, this term, extinction of experience, was not actually coined for ecologists. It was coined for the fact that in the modern world, fewer and fewer people have interactions with nature. And in this somewhat blurry slide, which I realize I probably should have uploaded a higher quality JPEG of it, hopefully you can more or less tell those are years. Here's an earlier one, here's a later one, and asking people their interactions with nature. So do they go hiking? Can they identify different species? How well do they know the natural world? And what we see is that with common lay people, not ecologists, from the 1990s up to the late 2000s, this paper is from 2016, but the data is a bit older than that, you see a marked drop-off in most measures of people's experience of the natural world. And that obviously is something to worry about, because people who don't know the natural world don't necessarily appreciate it. It also just means that there's fewer people in the pipeline to replace those of us who are biologists, who are specialists in certain taxa. And we've known about the decline of people's experience with the natural world for decades. I mean, you'll hear people complaining about it even in the 19th century. If you've read Engels's the Working Class of Manchester, he talks about something similar. That was published in the 1870s, but he was writing about the 1840s. So in a sense, this is a very old complaint. But even, just because a complaint is old doesn't mean that it is not true. Occasionally people are Cassandras. But it's now been extended to ecologists, and more people there's been more and more publications talking about the fact that fieldwork is less and less part of a professional ecologist's and a professional biologist's actual research experience. Very often fieldwork is now something that you do relatively rarely, predominantly only in the early stages of one's career. Maybe when you're doing your PhD, or if you're lucky in your postdoc, you'll get to have 1 or 2 field seasons, you collect your data, and then from then on, you might be more busy writing grant applications or teaching or doing more lab-based or computational-based work. And again, this is not a new complaint. These papers are relatively recent, and this one is particularly worrisome, I think, because if conservation science doesn't have fieldwork, then, where does? Because that is almost by definition, you do need to know if your conservation work is working in the field. If not, it's, what are we doing? That's the raison d'etre of the entire discipline. But it's not a new complaint. You'll notice that the naturalists are dying off. This paper is from 1996. So that's, I think that's from before most of when this room was born. So I'm not going to quite age, tell myself off here. But you can, so it's not a new complaint, but it is getting worse. And you can see this actually in objective terms, in terms of publications and in terms of journals. So these two are from Rio Saldaña et al. So this is looking specifically at conservation biology, because I didn't want to do my own analysis of all of ecology when I was doing this, and very thankfully, someone else did it for conservation biology. And here you can see that the percentage of studies which predominantly use fieldwork has been declining quite steadily since the 1980s. It was fairly stable for several decades, and this probably simply reflects that conservation biology as a discipline is only really from the late 1970s, and you don't get any theoretical papers until this point. But we've seen a continuous decline since then. But it's not just the percentage of papers that we are seeing a decline in field studies. It could just be that if it was simply a percentage case decline, maybe it wouldn't be very worrisome, because you have more people publishing things, and that simply reflects a smaller percentage of a bigger pie. Unfortunately, it's also in objective terms happening as well. Most types of papers, whether it be data analysis or modeling papers in conservation biology, have seen rather rapid growth. If you see here, this is in the hundreds of percentage growth of the number of papers published using those methodologies since the 1980s. There's actually been a decline in absolute numbers of papers in conservation biology that use fieldwork. This isn't necessarily that they use primarily fieldwork, these that have fieldwork at all in their components. And this is probably the part of ecology that is most field-based. So even the most field-based parts of ecology are seeing declines in absolute numbers of papers published that use fieldwork. So I think it's very clear that it is actually a phenomenon. It's not just old man in tweed complaining about things not being the way they were when he was an undergraduate. Funnily enough, it's not actually the first time that biology has been devaluing fieldwork. I'm not sure how many of you can recognize these fusty, bearded Edwardian and Victorian gentlemen. But if those of you may have read Bowler's History of the Environmental Sciences or know much about history of biology, will know that in the 1880s and 1890s, there was actually a big move in the professionalization of biology against what was considered fusty, old-fashioned natural history. That to be a proper science on par with physics and chemistry and mathematics, biologists must give up merely being pigeon fanciers and butterfly fanciers and go to the lab and focus on laboratory-based work. And there was actually a time when in this period where being a field biologist would probably hurt your career a bit. Just in case for those of you who don't know, Weissman, who discovered that germplasm, Morgan, who was very important, he's the first man to use Drosophila as his study organism. So if any of you have read interminable papers about fruit flies, blame him. Bateson, who was very important for bringing statistics into biology. So again, if any of you struggled through undergraduate statistics, you can blame him. And that is De Vries, the man who rescued Mendel's work. And even though Mendel is usually called the father of genetics, he really published more of the papers that were actually read by people in his lifetime. And the response then was to found this discipline, which at least some of us here are in, called ecology. Ecology was meant to be a way of rescuing field biology, rescuing natural history, and making it scientific. Obviously, that isn't the only thing that came into it. You also have wildlife management, you have different strands coming into ecology, but a big part of it was this modernization of what was seen in the 1880s and 1890s as an old-fashioned way of doing biology. So I'm not sure if anyone here recognizes these chaps. Anyone? No? That's Tansley, who was the first president of the British Ecological Society. If you ever wondered why the Journal of Ecology is only about plant ecology, it's because he was a botanist. So they actually began as purely a botanical society. They didn't have any zoology, or very little zoology. This is Brunel of the Brunelian niche. So if you've had to look anything, I'll talk a bit more about Brunelian niches in the future. He's that fellow. This is Elton of the Animal Ecology Lab of Oxford. And this is Huxley, who I put up there, purely because he was one of the first people to publish about animal behavior. His famous work on grebe mating in 1913, which was published in Nature, which is one of the first times where an observation of animal behavior in the wild was published in a scientific journal that wasn't a relatively obscure one. You had some people before him, like Selous, who was writing in the Journal of the Wessex Naturalist Association or something like that. Still a brilliant ornithologist, but not very influential. So given that ecology began as a response to turn natural history into a scientific discipline and to keep that element of the field, it is doubly worrisome that we are seeing a similar phenomena play out again, that the field is no longer valued in this very discipline that was created to keep fieldwork within biology. So what are the drivers of this? I would argue part of it stems from lack of capacity. I know saying, past times were better is a very reactionary take, and it's not necessarily true, but it is the case that starting from secondary school, those who study biology have less practical experience, especially in fieldwork, than their predecessors would have. So here you can see the percentage of the A-level biology curriculum in this country that is dedicated to ecology. And it declines a bit between the 1950s and 2017, but not that much. What really declines is how much time is spent in the field. So it's a bit surprising for those of us who came of age sort of in the modern era. But there was a time when if you did biology at A-level, you would spend a significant part of your time identifying plants, identifying birds, identifying insects. And this would be something you'd be examined on, and your actual field skills would be taught from that age. So skills which we now teach to undergraduates, if we teach them at all, would be learnt by 16, 17. This continues through undergraduate, where here we can see the minimum number of natural history courses as defined as courses about a taxa, as opposed to necessarily a process, so ornithology, ichthyology, botany, heptology, malacology, and so on, required for an American undergraduate course. And you will see that since 1995, on average, it's actually been zero. In most American universities, and I suspect most British universities, there aren't dedicated courses that are required to get a BA or a BSc in biology, where you will do in-depth work on a particular taxa or necessarily do field work. And that was certainly the case when I did my BA, which was, I might be old, but I'm not that bloody old. It is the case that, and textbooks also tend to include them less and less. So even at the undergraduate level, people who have chosen to study biology, the very people that you'd think would be most interested in these types of things, are less likely to learn about it than their predecessors generations ago. And this continues through the doctorate. This is, again, a North American example. These are from Tewksbury et al., 2014, where you see the overall number of biology doctorates in the United States has increased significantly. And we're all aware of that phenomenon. But what's interesting is that doctorates that primarily use fieldwork as a source of their data has actually declined in absolute numbers. Not just as a percentage, but again, in absolute numbers. There's fewer people each year getting doctorates in biology who are doing fieldwork as a primary methodology. And that, I think, is a bit worrisome. These other are different methodologies, so lab-based and modeling-based, and I forget what the third one is. But it's the one area of biology where we see actually fewer and fewer people doing it. I think that makes it fairly clear that there is actually an extinction of experience. It's not just being a fuddy-duddy old man. And it even goes all the way to the highest elements of this profession, as it's a vicious cycle, really, because as people don't learn the skills in secondary, then they don't learn them in undergraduate, then they don't do them in doctorate. By the time you get to the point of people being hired for permanent positions, many won't have the skills necessarily to teach field biology to new undergraduates. And this one I found, this was a survey of American early career, sort of relatively recently hired tenure track people. So these are people who already reached tenure track, and just over half said that they didn't have the skill set to teach a natural history course to undergraduates. Not necessarily a high level one, not necessarily an upper level one, just a introductory, ornithology 101, herpetology 101, pick your taxa, teach it, and teach the undergraduates how to do biology about that taxa. So we are having increasingly, even at the upper echelons of our profession, people don't know the taxa well enough that they don't think that they can teach it to undergraduates. And that, I think, is a crisis. So what is driving this? This is the one bit of paleo I think that you will get. So those of you, this is the Lapworth Museum of Geology. I thought I should include a paleo example. And this is actually a very good one. So how many of you will know the paleobiology database? I'm sure many of you use it. I've used it. It's a very good source of information. Studies that use data from that, as opposed to studies that just use data from collections that the authors themselves collected or that they went to analyze in museums themselves, have nearly 3 times as many citations on average. And we all know that this is a world of publish or perish, and beyond publish or perish, you need to have the citation metrics. I'm in the process of applying from my postdoc for permanent positions, and many will ask how many citations your articles have gotten. And this will be a major incentive of behavior. Because why would you invest what is often painful time? You're in the mud, you're in the rain, and it takes a lot of time to collect field data, to get a journal paper that will be in a low impact journal that is likely less cited than one that, I'm not saying it's not difficult. Macroecology is also a very difficult field to do right. I know that very well. But there is a difference when you have plumbing and electricity versus when you don't. Barriers to funding. We all know that the funding landscape is quite poor. In Britain, it's quite grim, and it's only going to get grimmer, I fear. And in the rest of the world, it's also very bad. The United States, as a percentage of GDP, now has funding in research, in research and in science, at the lowest point it's had since the American Civil War. So even before modern science. That is how bad it is in the US. Australia is significantly cutting science. Germany is cutting science. The Swiss are cutting. Practically every nation that has a serious science background is cutting science. And long-term studies, which are very important for fieldwork, or studies which you cannot promise will yield results, which almost by definition fieldwork cannot yield results. You cannot promise that it will yield results because the animals or the plants might not cooperate with you, have a hard time getting funded. Some of you will know Tim Birkhead, one of the best ornithologists, most cited ornithologists working today. His long-term field site in Scoma couldn't get funding 10 years ago. So, and that's probably one of the most well-known field sites in ornithology in Britain. So if he can't get funding, you know, we're all stuffed. Institutional barriers. I know a lot of us entered academia to do research. Turns out more and more over time, academics do less and less time doing research. I'm sure you're all aware of that. And unfortunately, it's only going to get worse. The higher education sector of this country, as you know, is not exactly doing brilliantly. We are facing university bankruptcies, mergers. 20,000 jobs have been lost over the last 3 years in the university sector. And that's only going to get worse. And in straitened times, universities are not particularly willing to give discretionary funds to do fieldwork, even within the country. And it extends to hiring decisions. Again, I do apologize for sort of being unremittingly bleak, but it's quite difficult to get an academic job. And when people are when you ask academics what they consider important in hiring, writing grants, publishing in high impact journals, all that's important. Fieldwork is a bit further down. It's not the lowest level thing. Science communication is actually the one that's considered least important for hiring, which really, not sure why I spent time doing this then. But it basically, compared to publishing and getting grant monies, everything else pales in significance. So if it doesn't lead to that, it probably will hurt your career to do it. To be a bit less bleak, not all the causes are negative. We are increasingly aware of the greenhouse gas emissions released when we do fieldwork, when we go to conferences abroad. Many departments will have policies to try to minimize this. I'm not sure if Birmingham does, but I'm aware in many universities, if you try to justify travel abroad, you have to spend a minimum amount of time there, or you need to really explain why you can't do it remotely. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? As biologists, we should probably be a bit conscious about the state of the world's ecosystem, and that includes reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Avoiding parachute science is the other. I know it can sound a bit odd for a man with a posh English accent talking about the loss of the good old days of fieldwork, but I'm not necessarily saying to go back to the days of Bates going to the Amazon and looking at the species there in his, well, he's not wearing a pith helm and that, but there is, I'm not saying a return to sort of the neo-colonialist ways of doing fieldwork. If you do fieldwork, always work with local people. Always make sure that your research is available in the local language. Teach at the local university if you can, and train up skills locally. Because bluntly, there's not, we will not catalogue the biodiversity of life on this planet unless we get a lot more good ecologists and good biologists and even good paleontologists working in South America and Africa and Asia and the other parts of the world where there just historically has not been the infrastructure for it, unfortunately. There's a greater emphasis on health and safety. Depends on your university again. I think Oxford, at least where I did my DPhil, took a bit more of a lax approach than Durham. But even then, it was less lax than it would have been 30 years ago. I'm not sure if any of you had to fill out a health and safety form nowadays, but they now, want to know where you're going to be staying. They want to know what the contingency plans are. And those are all good things. Obviously, I'm not against health and safety, but if you're doing field work, especially in remote areas, there is a greater chance that certain health and safety officers will look dimly upon certain locations, regardless of the scientific merit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. No. There's also simply the fact that you can actually now do good biology without having to do fieldwork. And I want to emphasize this. Modern macroecology would not be possible with things like GBIF, things like remote sensing, eBird. I'm an ornithologist, so I had to put on a bird reference there. The paleobiology database. These are great resources. I use them all the time in my research. I encourage you all to use them all the time in your research. Be critical of them. Be aware that they are just resources like any other, but they are bloody useful. And you get very interesting and good science out of them. And the other thing is just specialization. The days of a natural historian who could just know everything about their taxa are unfortunately gone. There's simply more stuff to learn. And you can be just a remote sensing specialist or a macroecologist who doesn't necessarily go into the field, or you can do an entire career without doing fieldwork in a way that in 1955 would have been impossible even if you desired to do no fieldwork in ecology. So I've discussed all this, but why should we care as macroecologists? Not in the broader scale of why we should care about the loss of extinction of experience amongst ecologists. I think that goes into a more values-laden question. But even if one were to be the most mercenary of macroecologists and only care about what is this to do with macroecology, why should you care? For one thing, it's a source of your bloody data. This is the records from GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information. I forget what the F stands for. Loads of data from all over the world. Most of it is occurrence data. Some of it isn't, but most of it is. And it is essentially all from fieldwork. Not necessarily recent fieldwork. A lot of it will be from museum collections. A lot of it will be from citizen science observations. But at some point, someone was in that location and recorded that species there for every single record there. And a lot of modern macroecology relies on GBIF, like a shocking amount. You cannot none of that data would be there without fieldwork. And you can probably see that there's still some empty spots on the map and places that are overrepresented. Europe, North America, Australia. If we want to be able to continue to do macroecology over the long term, we need to be helping our colleagues who do field biology to be collecting that data. Obviously, field biology is good on its own merits, but there is no field biology, no macroecology. It's that bloody simple. The other thing is that lack of data can also mean bad data, because as you may have noticed from this, as I said, it's not that we have an even distribution of the lack of data. Indeed, it is in many ways the opposite of the biodiversity of life. We have the most data in these temperate zones where we have a lot of scientists and a lot of birders and a lot of people with eBird and iNaturalist. And these tropical zones where biodiversity is highest are in many cases the places where we have the least records. So we are getting a misleading view of life. This is from an example of Centralian extinctions, which comes from an idea which was published in the 90s from a hillside called Centralia in Ecuador, which argued that in the tropics you have smaller niches, you have smaller range sizes, including micro ranges of certain species which will only be found on one or two hillsides, and therefore clearing out any hillside in this part of the world will lead to the extinction of those species. And it's true, you get a lot more species there, and they tend to have smaller ranges. However, when an actual systematic survey was done, not just of that hillside, but of the surrounding area, it went from being 98 species, which were thought to be endemic to just that hill, to one. The vast majority of species that were thought to be endemic purely because there was poor sampling. And if any of you have worked in the tropics, the ranges given by even very reputable sources like the IUCN for poorly studied tropical species will often be quite rubbish. The Titicaca grebe, for instance, that I worked on, the several populations very far from where the range officially ends. And the population figures are also just haven't been updated for a while. And that's fine, because there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of species aren't very well studied. But we won't correct that unless we have the fieldwork data. And as macroecologists, that bad data will change the results that we get and will almost certainly bias the results that we get. The other thing is, fieldwork allows you to actually know your system well enough to know if your results make sense. These are mallard ducks. I trust everyone recognizes them. One's a male, one's a female. I've done some work on sexual dichromatism in birds and its drivers, and it got a very big database of birds and which ones were dichromatic and which ones weren't, and using spectrophotometry data. And originally I was just going to use it naively because I thought it's a very big database. A lot of people have worked on it. It's well published. And then I looked into it and I thought, wait, this makes no bloody sense. It says mallards aren't dichromatic. Now, I happen to work on waterfowl. I happen to recognize a scientific name. I caught the mistake, and it turned out it was just I contacted the author. It turns out it had been put wrong in the CSV. Innocent mistake. But very often you will get, in these large databases, mistakes from when data is imported, or the way it's measured, or just naivety regarding the biology of the species. And just accepting the large databases naively will let those errors creep into our databases. And we'd like to think it all evens out. But it'd be even better to actually be able to check them ourselves. And if you know the study system well enough to check it itself, all the better. Hypothesis formation, not to toot my own horn too much, but I think it's no coincidence that before Wallace and Darwin did the great theoretical works, they both spent a lot of time in the field. Because nothing makes you think about how nature works, how ecology works, like actually seeing it there. I've nothing but respect for those who do models ex nihilo. God, goodness knows I couldn't do that. But I do think that nature is queerer than one can suppose, and that seeing it, or observing it, leads you to forming hypotheses that you can test in a macro scale, and it can be very productive in that sense as well. And this isn't a macroecology thing. This is just one as someone who cares about biodiversity, I think you should care about. If you're less exposed to nature, odds are you care less about whether it's preserved. So this is a meta-analysis of exposure to nature with being involved in nature conservation, changing behavior in response to nature conservation efforts. And on average, being exposed to nature does actually make you more likely to care about conserving it. The causality, I'm not entirely sure of, but I still think it probably is a good thing as macroecologists if we don't end up studying purely dead systems. With the greatest will in the world to the paleontologists, you study brilliant things as well, but I'd want there to be biodiversity in 100 years' time as well. So now it gets to the point where I talk about my own research and why I think this is important and how I've mixed the two up. And as you can see, this is me in my natural habitat when I'm doing fieldwork. I did say that I didn't want to return to the days of the pith-helmeted European. However, I do admit the pith helm is just a very practical thing to wear on fieldwork. It genuinely is. It's light, it's heavy, it's hard. It covers your head from the sun. It's actually a brilliant hat. So there's a reason it got adopted. And most of my fieldwork has been up in Lake Titicaca, up in the Andes, at nearly 4,000 meters in altitude between Peru and Bolivia. Don't let my accent fool you, but my family's originally from South America. I was born in the northern part of the Andean range in Bogota, but obviously I'm not Peruvian or Bolivian, so I'm still a foreign researcher in those parts. And I'll talk about 3 examples of how fieldwork and macroecology is melded in my own research: sexual dichromatism, niche changes, and same-sex sexual behavior. And I've left the sex for last. Sexual dichromatism, you all know what it is, or I hope you do, but for those who don't, in many species, the sexes of each sex of bird has very different coloration. Here you see probably the most famous example. I think that there's somewhere, if you ever do a presentation on sexual dichromatism, there's a contract you need to sign that says you must include a picture of a peacock and a peahen. Here's the peahen, here's the peacock. Darwin mentions it in The Descent of Species. There's a reason. It's iconic for a bloody reason. Unfortunately, birds in the Andes are not so usefully dichromatic. It is not something I'd thought about until I was out there doing population surveys and trying to get more than just data on how many of them there are, but also demographic data of do we see biases in mortality between males and females? How's the demography of the wild populations? And here you can see the Titicaca grebe, the Puna ibis, the Andean coot. Can you tell which one's the male and which one's the female? I can't. For all I know, they're all males or they're all females or a mix of both. It's bloody frustrating. And in Lake Titicaca, not a single one of the waterfowl species is dichromatic, which is ruddy annoying. So I did what I think a lot of us do when you have an idea that you think, that's a bit strange. I went to see what literature had been published. Turns out there has been some work on altitude and dichromatism. Badiev in 1997, using human scoring, essentially just asking people, all right, on a scale from -1 to 1, how dichromatic is this species? Said that there was a clear pattern of it decreasing with altitude. Beltran et al. A bit more recently, also using human scale, found a bit of a pattern, but it was mediated by the type of environment. So I thought, well, let's see if this is the case. So as I said, I used this big database, which had both human scoring and spectrophotometry scoring, the one I mentioned earlier. This has been published in the Journal of Zoology if you want to read it, or more importantly, cite it. And there's a kind of a pattern. It is likely to be in the higher altitudes one, but you don't see that pattern with the human scored dichromatism. And the reason is a lot more of that dichromatism is in the ultraviolet, which sort of makes sense. Many birds can see in the ultraviolet. I should say this was only in passerines I was looking at, so ironically I abandoned the waterfowl once I did the macroecology, but still hypothesis formation. And it turns out that simply at those higher latitudes, it's more likely that plumage used for signaling is an ultraviolet, and that includes sexual signaling. So the hypothesis originated Fieldwork, and it benefited also from a bit of ethology and sensory ecology, in case there's any sensory ecologists here this evening. Now's the work which I presented in Zurich, which is how I met Harriet, and this is the one connection with paleontology. So this is the string which allows this to be connected to the Lapworth Museum, which is niche changes to the Holocene and Pleistocene. Now, this was born from strange results in the field in Lake Titicaca there, more specifically in La Reserva Nacional del Titicaca, which is in this bay area here, which is that flightless birds like the Titicaca grebe, their populations seem to be relatively stable, actually, when we'd expect them not to be. While birds that can fly great distances, like these flamingos, they're declining a fair bit. So why is that? Now, the reason why that's a bit weird is we'd expect that the flightless Andean birds to be stuffed, to use a technical term. This is the elevator towards extinction. Lots of people work on it, Urban, Freeman, a couple of others. And it's well documented in a lot of microscales that as the climate is warming due to human activity, and birds, especially in tropical areas that have specialized in these relatively stable climatic niches within a certain altitude, are exposed to those changing temperatures, they move up the mountainside to go to where the new ideal climate is, and those near the top just go extinct. So I thought, well, that isn't what we're seeing in Lake Titicaca. Is this just a peculiar local thing? I thought, well, these bird species have been here for most of the Quaternary, or at least Holocene and Pleistocene. They've seen environmental changes. So maybe it's simply a different way of adapting. When the environment changes, you can either adapt to the new one, go extinct, or move to a new place. And we know from plants, actually, that poor dispersers, those whose seeds can't disperse very well, tend to actually have a fair bit of plasticity in how they respond to their changing environments. Or rather, their fundamental niche is a lot wider than their realized niche. So the question is this the case with birds? Are poor dispersers, which I used categories from flightless to flying, and also use the hand-wing index, which is commonly used for dispersal ability in birds, does that affect their response throughout the Holocene and late Pleistocene to environmental change? Kind of. Basically, we only saw what we predicted in the Holocene. That's probably because I don't know enough paleontology. This is a paper where I probably should have collaborated with a paleontologist from the get-go, rather than it being a couple of ornithologists who are used to fieldwork stumbling into paleontology. But the results are quite interesting. They're still under review. And overall, it does seem that the poorer the dispersal ability, the greater the niche change from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. So that does seem to support our hypothesis, but there are some nuances there. But one of which goes back to what I was saying of why fieldwork matters, even for you paleontologists. For some reason, avians really like to fossilize in North America and Europe. For some reason. They don't like to fossilize in the tropics, in Asia. They really like it in New Zealand. Just happens to be some very good ornithological paleontologists have been working in New Zealand for multiple decades, but I'm sure that's a complete coincidence. So I suspect that the pattern we are seeing is not exactly a purely biological one. Finally, same-sex sexual behavior in birds. This one I'll go by a bit quicker. And those are two female Lasian albatrosses there. For once, theory came first. I should say I did my master's working on same-sex sexual behavior in my MRes, and it's sort of been something I've been interested in throughout my career. There's lots of literature on it, but one of the interesting ones is this idea that you actually don't necessarily need to have selection for it. You can just have selection against sex discrimination if the cost of identifying the opposite sex is quite high, and if the cost of negatively of accidentally rejecting a potential mate is quite high as well. So if you have a low population density and you only find a conspecific every 6 months, why take the risk? And there you can see that, if you're a solitary eagle versus these birds in a breeding colony, and if you are these parrots, which are very dichromatic, versus these Andean gulls, which we thought were dichromatic because there's a variant with a black cap, which turns out nothing to do with sex nor age. We actually don't know why there's two variants of the plumage that just are. It will vary in the cost. And that's male-male courtship behavior, male-male mounting. Those two, it does seem, as the population density decreases, you do see more male-male mounting and male-male courtship behavior. Funnily enough, not with female-female. However, when it comes to brain size, for which we use as a proxy for, how well can you distinguish, you actually have more of it. So you have more male-male pair bonding with species that are cleverer. Don't know why. And the only effect we found with dichromatism is that female-female mounting is more common, which again is not what we expected. So not exactly the results we wanted, but still one I found very interesting. However, this is one where, again, fieldwork is necessary because of the sheer lack of bloody data. So this is a bunch of papers where there's enough papers, a bunch of species where there's enough papers published on their sexual habits where we feel relatively confident, where we can talk about is same-sex sexual behavior present or absent, and it's coded by male, female, or recorded in both. The orange is recorded in both, and you can see it's actually very few. And the vast majority where it is recorded, it's just one note of someone saying, well, I saw this once. So for this, I think, quite interesting behavior, and for a lot of other behaviors, we plain don't have enough data to do more than even preliminary macroecological studies. And that's the case for a lot of macro behavior, which is this growing field within macroecology, which is really stymied by the lack of field data on animal behavior. I'm actually applying for a leverhulme about this subject, so who knows? Maybe in a few years' time, I shall come back with results discussing this deficit, having done my small part to fix it. So, what is to be done? And there's precisely one person in the Zoom call who gets the in-joke, and if you all get it, please let me know. First, citation metrics. Many of us here are scientists. Many of us here publish things. Cite the primary literature. I know it's annoying. I know, especially when you're doing GBIF or when you're using these big databases, to cite the primary literature does mean that you are citing possibly thousands of different articles. However, it is necessary if we want that primary literature to continue to exist for us to properly acknowledge it. First of all, it's just good manners. We wouldn't accept the idea that you don't cite the source of your data for practically anything else. I don't see why it's acceptable here. I know a lot of journals don't really like having many citations, but at a certain point, if we want field biology to continue to exist, we need to cite the primary literature. And increasingly, our packages do have functions like this. This is from McIntosh's latest R package, Plutal, which is about avian phylogeny, which does a super tree of genetic super tree of birds. And if you do one where you get just the species that you use and you get the trees, this will give you the citations of every source of data used to make that tree. So you just get a list formatted, ready to put into your paper. If you are involved in journals, if you're a reviewer, insist on seeing the primary literature. I know gatekeeping is a dirty word, but part of science is gatekeeping. And as reviewers, we are the gatekeepers to try to ensure that good practice in good science is done. Sortie, which I think many of you are aware of, and I really admire their work, has been actually very good, essentially through the popular mobilization of reviewers to force journals to change the policy to be more transparent with the data. Essentially saying that, in many cases, I've certainly done this before, where you say, unless there's a good reason why primary data cannot be shared with this article, I cannot recommend it for publication, without seeing the primary data. Unfortunately, part of that is also against people falsifying data. There have been many scandals of that over the decades. And having code editors is now really key for a modern journal as well. And the old limitation of why we couldn't have 2,000 references in an article is gone, because even though I really actually like physical journals, I'll be honest, I'm one of the few people I think who still reads IBIS physically when I can get my hands on it. Journals no longer come like this. When's the last time any of you got a physical journal of a new journal, not going through the archives for an old one? Never. You can go your entire career as a scientist nowadays solely using online articles. There's no page limit there. You're not getting charged extra by the page as much. The cost of ink and paper, which was the bigger limiting factor, doesn't matter as much. And increasingly, most journals don't even have a print option. If you're an editor, if you have a citation maxima, as a lot of the very prestigious journals have, try to argue against it. I know that I'm a ECR and will probably be annoying some people when I say this, but if we want to properly cite things, saying that you're only allowed to cite 40 articles when you're getting data from a load of different sources is essential, and then chucking it into the supplementary, is institutionalized plagiarism almost. And not quite plagiarism because it's in the supplementaries, but it's skirting a fine bloody line. So if you are in the position where you are on the editorial board of a journal and you can help change policies, push to change the policies. Curriculum development, some people here will be involved in curriculum development. When it comes to the university, making sure that there is a field component to most undergraduate biology courses. A lot of places do have a field component, but it's less and less. Part of that will be costs. I accept there's limitations, but we can fight for that. And also, this will surprise you, but Parliament actually runs public inquiries quite frequently on the secondary school education curricula. That's how we end up getting the new natural history GCSE, which some of you may have heard of, which I think is a positive development. Pay attention to what public inquiries are being done. And trust me, I have a lot of friends who work in Parliament. A lot of friends of mine are members of Parliament. If you are an academic and you contact these public inquiries and you have something relevant to say, odds are they will actually listen to you. They will actually invite you to come down or to contribute. So do so. Hiring, I admit, this is probably one where we just, the market's saturated. I'm sure we all know the stats. Less than 1% of PhDs in the sciences get a permanent professor job. And this was over 10 years ago. I'm pretty sure it's gotten worse. But if we want there to be field biologists that get hired and you're on a hiring committee, value fieldwork. When you're looking at positions opening in biology and you want to balance the department out, if you see there's not many field workers in your department, maybe suggest that you specifically advertise saying this position will go to someone who does fieldwork. I recently saw an advertisement in Cambridge Plant Sciences that did that, actually. They were hiring someone explicitly to be a field botanist. And I think it was on Blue Sky, one of the people there who was on the hiring committee was commenting that they'd been fighting for this for over a decade. and they finally got it through. So I think there is positive developments in that regard. And if you can say that, if your department doesn't have a field worker, encourage them when hiring comes around to put that as the thing they want. Also remember, fieldwork doesn't have to be global. I know I've talked about my work in the tropics, and that I love the tropics. But learning bird identification skills locally, knowing your local wildlife, being able to just pick up the skills to teach wildlife identification to undergraduates doesn't have to be particularly hard. The RSPB has these wonderful pocket guides for British birds. The Royal Entomological Society has ones for insects, has ones for lots of taxa, Collins Field Guides. I'm sure many biologists are bird watchers already, but the RSPB also does stuff on mammals, despite the name of it being about birds. You can learn to do bird ringing relatively easily. If you want to learn to prepare bird skins, that's, I would argue, easier, but it's probably more difficult to get a license. That's probably just because I learned how to prepare bird skins first, so I'm just biased in that regard. But you go on the BTO website, you will find people who will train you up to do ringing, and they will teach you. And anyone who has seen the average age of ringers in this country know we need more young bird ringers, because I forget the exact average age, but I think it's in the 60s. Even this type of amateur amateur in the sense of they are not paid to do this natural history work is graying and going out. So if we want to continue the great tradition of British field ornithology, which is genuinely a great tradition of this country, we do need young people to learn to do this work. Funding is where we definitely have the least interest. I mean, this is one where, unfortunately, we do have politicians who do not see the value of field biology, of ecology. Increasingly, I think we are seeing politicians that don't see the value of funding research full stop. I don't want this to become a political lecture, because this is an apolitical institution. But I will say that talk to the ministers, regardless of party, whenever they're in government, who have oversight over UKRI, over DFI, because they run the university sector, and DSIT, and to your local member of parliament. A lot of MPs will, especially where you all live, will be representing university areas. And especially if they're a backbencher, odds are they will be willing to talk to you. And they will be interested. At least they'll pretend to be. So that's my talk. I know it was probably a bit different from the usual paleo. Any questions?